What is up? Welcome to another edition of the Utilization Report Debrief. I'm Marcus Grant, joined by Dwayne McFarland, back with you after a whole week off. I assume you got the whole week off. What did you do with that time?
Yeah, they gave me the whole week, Marcus. So got to go hang out with the family. We went to Destin. It was a double red flag day, many days. So a couple days we couldn't get in the ocean,
Mm,
and the other days it was a single red. But we made the most of it. We still have fun. I got a tan, so
nice.
got out, got a tan, and drafted a lot of fantasy teams sitting on the beach. So with a cerveza in my hand, we'll see how those squads turn out. Maybe not good.
But you know what? You had fun doing it, and that's the important part. Yeah, I actually got to kind of hang out. We stayed close to home. I did take the kid to Disneyland one day, and I had a moment where we're waiting in line for Dumbo, and I'm looking at my phone. My wife looks over and she's like, "Are you doing a draft right now?" I was on the clock at that point. I'm like, "Yeah, it's a slow. It's a bet. Don't worry about it. Yeah, it's fine." But otherwise, a very, very good week. And glad to be back with you all as we get into the heat of summer and get a little bit closer to the
Yeah, I
start
was
of training camp.
I was getting some weird looks when I was being asked to do certain things, and I'm like, I'm in the middle of a draft. I felt like one of the kids, and you go to them, they're like, I'm in the middle of a match. You're like, so
Right.
what, man? We got stuff to do. Well, now I'm like, I'm doing the kid thing.
Yeah, exactly. Now you understand. Not that we didn't, because we were all kids too at some point. So we're talking wide receivers today, but maybe in a little bit of a different slant. Dwayne, you went and decided to dig into some aging elite wide receivers. And we're going to kind of dive into some of the things you found out about some of these guys, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this year we've talked about it many times already on the show. Like, if you haven't drafted yet, the wide receiver craze is in full effect. So, I mean, look, you've got to draft wide receivers early. It's just table stakes. Like, you can't avoid it. If you wait, you're going to get pummeled and you're going to be in trouble, especially in best ball. We'll see how redraft turns out, but I have a feeling some of these trends are gonna seep over. We haven't seen it yet, but the main point here being is that with wide receivers going earlier than ever, there's also this weird kind of twist to it, which is the fact that we've got so many really good wide receivers that are starting to age. Marcus, we've got 7 guys that have 4 plus wide receiver one finishes on their career resume, reaching age 31 or 32 this year. Now, I'm rounding age, so you guys, we'll talk more about the research in a minute, but that's a lot. So we have a lot of guys that we've depended on for a long time, and I just really, when that I started thinking about all these dynamics, I was like, this is something a lot of people have looked at. I've looked at it in the past, but I really need to go back and look at it again.
Well, I think nowadays it's even more important because the league is so flush with talented wide receivers. That You talked about those, some of these older guys that we're used to drafting, that we're so comfortable with having on our rosters, that, as you mentioned, are starting to get up there in age. And while it's easy to just click on their names, maybe there are some things we should look at a little bit more in terms of, when we're drafting them, how often we're drafting them, and that sort of thing. But let's just start with kind of the 30,000-foot view, just the general impact of age on wide receivers. I mean, some of it I think feels sort of intuitive,
Intuitive.
right? I mean, younger guys tend to have a longer shelf life, right? But you kind of broke it down sort of by age cohort, if you will.
Yeah, so what I decided to do was look at the best 3-year stretch for every wide receiver that I've got data for back to 2011, and I essentially called that their prime. Now, I needed to have their whole career to be able to look at it. I didn't just if I just had a guy that only had the last 3 years of his career, I threw that out. So for the guys that I had the full career for, I wanted to look at, okay, what were typically the best 3 years of their career, and I called that their prime. Then I compared each age cohort, if you will, to that prime. And so what percentage of those points, did they get to? And when you look at those wide receivers that are age 21 to 23, and we've got a pretty cool graphic here for you, Marcus, but look at those wide receivers age 21 to 23, 84% of their prime is what they reached in those years. And then wide receivers age 24 to 27, 93%. So that's the real sweet spot. Those age 24 to 27 wide receivers, they're at their peak powers. And again, I'm rounding here. So whichever age they were the closest to when their NFL season began. So it's kind of, look, sometimes you might have been 25.6 and it's going to say you're 26, but that's the methodology that I use. You can change it up. You still pretty much get the same results, but just know that I did round. But then if you look at that age 28 to 29 bucket, it's essentially the same as the 21 to 23, 84% of their prime production in those seasons. And then if you look at age 30, it starts to drop off a little bit, 78%, but that's still good.
Mhm.
And then you look at ages 31, 32, and 33 plus. And if we're thinking of, old school, we got a letter grade back in our days in
Right.
school, Marcus, those are D's and F's. You're getting an
Mhm.
F down there at 33 plus. Now, this is across the entirety of the NFL. So all wide receivers, whatever their prime was, maybe their best season ever was, maybe their best 3 year stretch was they were a wide receiver 4. Okay. So these percentages are based on that. But it also left me wondering, because of these wide receivers we just talked about, like Keenan Allen and Davante Adams and Cooper Kupp, that are coming into these older ages, like, how did they perform? What did they look like if we specifically looked at their cohort?
Well, one of the things that I took away from this, one of the first things that popped off to me is we talked for so many years about wide receivers and sort of that third year breakout. And this sort of, I think, kind of ties into that, right? If you talk about that 24 to 27 age range, depending on when guys come into the league, about 24, you're usually entering your third season. And I know, look, I know guys have started to break out earlier than that, but that was always sort of the thing we counted on for years. Like, hey, man, it's a wide receiver in his third year. This is when we start to see these guys take the leap. And this sort of, I think, points to
Yeah.
that again
They,
outside of the
so
elite guys.
And there can be different levels of breakout, right? You could have been a wide receiver 4 as a rookie and you turn into a wide receiver 2 in year 2. Well, that's a breakout, right? You just
Yeah.
made a big jump. But then you could go from being a low end wide receiver 2 to a high end wide receiver 3, moving from year 2 to year 3. And the data really showed all that as well. So essentially, what it's saying, you're more likely to be a fantasy producer, in your years 2 and 3. Year 1, it can also happen. We're seeing more rookies do it. But really, that sweet spot where we know they're going to be performing at their prime levels, that's the age 24 to 27.
So now let's talk about some of the elite guys, because it's those elite guys that tend to have the longer careers, right? If you are performing at a high level earlier in your career, chances are you're going to stick around, barring injury, to the 30, 31, 32. So when you look at the elite guys, because father time comes for us all, how long can we count on these guys, and when do we have to worry that maybe they're going to start to hit that cliff?
Yeah, the results of this were kind of, they're twofold. I think there's some things we need to look at and consider. Okay, there is some risk here, but it wasn't bad. If you look at the elite wide receivers, and the way I define an elite wide receiver, they had to have at least 3 wide receiver 1 finishes on their resume over this period of time. And if they did, they got included in this cohort. And if you look at age 30, the average score was 16.4. So that's a wide receiver 1. The average wide receiver 1 score since 2011 is 16 fantasy points per game. And then at age 31, they dropped down to a low end wide receiver 2, right at the threshold for a wide receiver 2, which is 14 fantasy points per game. Then at age 32, the average was 13.6. So you're moving into that wide receiver 3 range, and then so on. You get to age 33, basically you're in the wide receiver 4 range. So the way I looked at this, I then wanted to break it down by wide receiver 1 finishes, 2, 3, or wide receiver X means essentially they were below wide receiver 3.
Mhm.
I get it, guys. You get a wide receiver 4 finish. Maybe you're not thinking that's the cliff, but to me, it is. You don't really want that player in your lineup. They're not going to win. They're fine. You got a bye week. You need to move them in there. Okay, great. But they're not winning your league for you, right? And really, you could argue that maybe I should have made this cutoff at wide receiver 2, but I made it at wide receiver 3. So if you look at that age 30, you're in really good shape, Marcus. Okay,
Mhm.
50% of the time, you're still a wide receiver 1. And then if you look at the rest of the time, 17% you were a wide receiver 2, or 33% you're a wide receiver 3. But when you move to that next bucket, you're still getting the wide receiver 1s almost at the same rate, 46%. But remember, you're losing some of these guys every year. So your sample's getting smaller. But of the guys that remain, almost half of them still get a wide receiver 1. That's honestly better than what I expected it to be. But your bust rate also goes up. So your chance of not even being a wide receiver 3 matches that at 46%. And then it goes up a little bit more once you move down to age 32. Actually, it's about the same. So you got 50%, again, in that wide receiver 1 bucket. Again, similar bust rate. But once you get to age 33, all bets are kind of off. Like the wide receiver 1 stuff, that's gone. You're now at 0%. Wide receiver 2, you still get a few of those finishes, but mostly you're looking at wide receiver 3 and wide receiver 4 or worse finishes. So 46% of the group being below. So you lose some of that upside, right? Once you get to that age 33. And the average cliff age, meaning dropping below a wide receiver 3 finish for the elites, those guys that had at least 3 top 12 finishes, was 33 years old. That was markedly better than the next subgroup that I also plotted out when I did the research, which were guys that were primarily wide receiver twos over the course of their career. Their cliff age was age 30. So there is something to the elite wide receivers being able to stick around a little bit longer, but there certainly is more and more risk the further you move along in their career.
What I've noticed, you look at the age 31, 32 buckets, and it feels like it's an all or nothing proposition in a lot of ways for some of these guys. Either
It's a coin flip.
they're going to be really, really good and they're going to help you carry your teams, or you're going to either, you'll be staring at them in your lineup, giving you like, eights, nines every week and wondering, what am I doing? Why am I holding on? And the 33 one I thought was interesting because it seems like, okay, they're not necessarily high end guys, in the wide receiver one, but there's still a chance for them to be productive. If more than half the time they're giving you wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3 finishes, these are guys that you don't mind sort of having on your roster and sort of hanging on with them a little bit. Um, so obviously we're trying to avoid these guys that are hitting the cliff, and we sort of have an idea of about when it's going to happen. When you were diving into some of this stuff and researching it, did you find a way to sort of predict, I mean, because look, we're all sort of trying to put on our magic, Harry Potter sorting hats and figure out which guys are which. Have you figured out when guys are starting to hit that cliff?
Yeah, so I decided to bucket these players out and look, are there signs before the cliff? And is, just kind of this idea of, well, how did the elite wide receivers go down? Well, they all try to go down swinging, but it can be sudden, it can be gradual, so we've got another really cool slide here for you. When you look at it, and there were 18 guys in the total bucket, Marcus, looking back, and these are the who's. You guys will know who these people are. You're thinking back to your Larry Fitzgerald guys. You're thinking to Julio Jones, AJ Green, these guys are all in the pool. Okay. So these were guys you loved having on your fantasy team whenever they were young and when they were healthy. But 4 of them managed to avoid the cliff altogether, meaning they basically just got to retirement and they were done. Now, I will say the minimum you had to have was 200 routes in a season, and I'm doing points per game, not total points. So some of them could have gotten injured, not finished a season. Like Steve Smith's a good example at age 36. He was a wide receiver 1 for 7 games, and then we lost him. Okay. So he still is technically getting in this group, because what I wanted to do is look at, hey, look, when they were on the field, could they perform? Because I'm not pretending I can predict injuries. We'll talk more about injuries here in just a little bit. But 4 guys actually didn't have a cliff. So 22% of the sample. Sudden drop off, meaning we had no indicator. These guys were elite wide receiver 1, and you mentioned it on the screen before, looking at those ages 32 and 31 and 32. Poof, they were just gone. Well, that's 22% of the sample. 4 guys, we didn't get any sort of notice, but gradual declines, meaning we saw them maybe step down to a wide receiver 2, then a wide receiver 3 before they hit that wide receiver 4 mark. We had 4 of those as well. And then there's this other bucket. I wasn't sure what to call it. I just called it turbulence, because we've got sudden, we've got gradual turbulence. It's just what it sounds like. You're kind of in the plane and it's like an immediate drop. And then all of a sudden, you shoot back up in altitude. So these are guys that were doing really good. Then they kind of dropped off. They may have been a wide receiver 1, dropped down to a wide receiver 3, or even a wide receiver 4 year. And then they bounce back to being a wide receiver 1. So a great example on some of these, you got to look at the context. T.Y. Hilton was a great example of that. But if you look at his 2 years where he fell off, what happened? He didn't have Andrew Luck. He was having to deal with a backup quarterback. So I'll try to talk about some of those things as well. But the final bucket, Marcus, were guys that had an injury. So they were good. Then they had an injury. But at least you had a sense like, this guy was injured. I may want to kind of lay off of him the next year. Let's see what happens. He's getting older. So the way I ended up thinking about this, if you look at it across all of these guys, we had 14 cliff instances. 10 of them came from players already showing a decline, that gradual decline, or they had turbulence, or they had an injury. So that means 71% of these guys, there was at least some sort of flag for the elites telling us that, we might want to take a step back here and maybe we should think a little bit differently about these players. And what's interesting about that is for the other cohort of wide receivers, which was focused on guys that had primarily been wide receiver 2s over the course of their career, only 53% of them came with some sort of warning, meaning turbulence, gradual, or an injury. So the elite wide receivers did actually outperform the wide receiver 2s as far as being able to hold on to their fantasy relevance. And so that's a positive in my opinion. Now, again, I'm not saying this stuff is predictive. We don't have a big enough sample to say these things are predictive. Even if I go back and grab the last 30 years, it won't be a big enough sample to be predictive. We're still descriptive, but is giving us something, at least something that we can use to try to analyze and sift through these guys to get at the question you just asked, which is, hey, is there a way to predict these things? So I'm trying to avoid guys that are already showing signs more so than guys that haven't, because only 22% of those guys went on to, not performing. We had 71% of them showed us something on their resume saying, might want to be careful.
Yeah, I mean, basically, looking at the numbers, you got a 1 in 5 shot essentially of picking the guy who just is smooth sailing all the way to the end of his career. Those aren't necessarily the best odds if you're talking about it. And you're right. I think some of this stuff is never going to, like injury. You can't really predict for injury, all the time. Although you can certainly look at guys who are coming off injury and sort of try to figure those things out. And then the guys with the sudden cliff, that's always going to be one of life's great mysteries.
I will say for the injuries, I did also look at that. We didn't make a slide or anything for it, but of the guys that were age 30 plus, when they had an injury that was severe enough to keep them from at least 200 routes in a season, 40% of them rebounded to a wide receiver 1 finish. 20% turned around the next year and gave you a wide receiver 2 finish, and then you had another 40% that just fell off the cliff, never to be heard from again. So again, just like the rest of the data, like there's been some examples of success, but there's also been examples of failure, almost a coin flip on those players.
UFC 303. It's this Saturday in Las Vegas. Could it get any better? Of course it can. When you get in on the action with our partners at DraftKings Sportsbook, the official sports betting partner of the UFC. It's a banger of a card with the light heavyweight title on the line in the main event. From the much anticipated title fights to the exciting undercard bouts, DraftKings is giving new customers a shot to get in on the action all night long. Now, are you new to DraftKings? Then check this out. New customers who bet $5 get $150 in bonus bets instantly. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. Use our code DEBRIEF. The crown is yours. Now, that's right. New customers can bet just $5 on anything and receive $150 in bonus bets instantly. If sports betting is not yet available in your state, don't worry. DraftKings is the one-stop shop for all things daily fantasy, where you can join in on all the fun and have a shot to win cash prizes. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. New customers use our promo code DEBRIEF and bet just $5 on any wager. Get $150 in bonus bets instantly. That's promo code DEBRIEF only at DraftKings Sportsbook. All right, so then let's get into some of these guys individually, and we'll break it down by the age cohort, starting with the age 32 guys. So sort of the high end of the age scale there. You got 3 guys on this list, and I will tell you that even without knowing any of the signs, any of the research you kind of get, I looked at these 3 names and I immediately thought to myself, like, these are 3 guys that I have been very hesitant on drafting coming into this. And so now I'm very curious as you sort of dive into some of the individual reasons, whether or not that sort of validate. Yeah, look, this is it's confirmation bias, right? Is what I'm kind of
Right.
looking at right here. But I
Exactly.
mean, let's start with Davante Adams, right? Who has been one of the elites in this league for a long time. There are a lot of things changing in Las Vegas, but also, I mean, the whole point of this thing is he's getting older. So what are you seeing with Davante?
Yeah, I mean, he's going in. He's in that age 32 season again, rounding age. The way I did the research, ADP right now, wide receiver 13. If you're doing best ball drafts, that's round 2. Some drafts that'll be a little later, but he's being basically taken as a high end wide receiver 2, low end wide receiver 1 right now. But we definitely have signs with Davante Adams. So last year he fell to 70% of his prime production. That was a wide receiver 2 season at 15.6 fantasy points per game. That's the first wide receiver 2 season we've had from him since year 4. Now, that's not terrible. It's not like he fell to a wide receiver 3. It's not like he fell to a wide receiver 4. Like that would be a much bigger alarm bell. But at age 32, we've seen the first signs of it. Still a solid target earner, 31% target share, but his yards per route run has been down a little bit, Marcus, 1.97. And he had really big struggles against man coverage. Now, I'm not going to talk about how predictive any of this stuff is because I haven't finished researching that part of it. If you guys want that, you have to come back and get the article, which is going to drop on Friday. So I'm going to go deeper into some of these other things that may give us more signal around age beyond fantasy points per game, which right now is still king. It's still better than targets. It's still better if you're trying to predict what's going to happen the next year. The strongest signal is still fantasy points per game in the year before. And so when we look at Davante Adams, he did fall to that wide receiver 2 status. But whenever I look at this, we've seen 2 elite wide receivers rebound. historically, from an even worse thing than what we saw with Davante. He was only a wide receiver 2. We've seen 2 guys fall to wide receiver 4 status, and they've still turned around and post a wide receiver 1 finish. So there's a chance that Davante Adams could still rebound, Marcus. You look at Steve Smith, already mentioned him. That was at age 36. He was putting up a wide receiver 1 season, but again, only lasted 7 games. The better example is Larry Fitzgerald. He fell to 10.9 fantasy points per game in 2014 at age 31, but he rebounded to deliver a wide receiver 1 finish at 17.8, then wide receiver 2 at 15.4, and then the following year, another wide receiver 1. So 2 more wide receiver 1 finishes on his resume in the next 3 years. But you got to go back and look at the context. What happened? In 2014, Carson Palmer went down, only played 6 games. He was getting passes from Drew freaking Stanton and Ryan Lindley. So that was really the cause for his fall off. Well, you look at Davante Adams, you could kind of say the same thing. You're like, well, maybe it's an Aiden O'Connell thing. Well, the problem is we don't have Carson Palmer to step in and rescue us. We've got Gardner Minshew, who maybe it could be better than Aiden O'Connell slightly, or we've got Aiden O'Connell, who we need to take a step forward. So I'm worried about the quarterback situation. We've already seen some signs of decline. And then you look at this price tag, it's the most expensive one, Marcus, coming off the board in round 2. Davante Adams is a fade for me right now. I don't know what your thoughts are, though.
I know I've just been very concerned. I mean, I think when I go back to Davante Adams, the one thing that I can sort of hold on to is he is still the alpha dog in that offense, and he's going to be the guy that demands most of the targets. But beyond that, I just have so many other question marks. You mentioned the quarterback situation. Is it, is it Gardner Minshew? Is it Aiden O'Connell? I mean, last reports I saw that O'Connell might have the lead there. We sort of saw what that looks like a little bit. New head, well, now Antonio Pierce is the full-time head coach. There are changes in the offense. There's just a lot more questions than I have certainties with Davante Adams. And then you throw in the price tag for it, and it's made me very hesitant. I've drafted little to no Davante Adams across my best ball squad because I just have some uncertainty there. So let's move from him over to Keenan Allen, who's another guy that I have been unsure about. I have been a little bit more proactive in drafting Keenan Allen, but I had a lot of questions about him as well. What are some of the things you saw with him so far?
Yeah, he's one of the guys that actually triggered a lot of this research because you and I talked about him a couple times on previous pods, and we were kind of like, we're just not comfortable with Keenan Allen. We don't click on his name. And I was like, I got to go back and look at this stuff again because I hadn't looked at it in really 2 seasons. And so I wanted to refresh all this. But Keenan was the instigator for a lot of this. And then it turns out, as I started looking at it, I was like, hey, idiot, like there's 7 of these dudes that all fit this criteria. So, wake up. But looking at Keenan, he's coming off a 7th consecutive wide receiver 1 worthy point per game season. Now, injuries have been a deal. He's missed 2, 1, 7, and 4 games over his last 4. We do sometimes see injuries with older players start to become a more consistent theme. But there's also last year you heard he could have came back in and played the rest of the season, but the Chargers were just done. They were cooked. So, you got to take some of those things with context. But staying on the field's been a bit of a challenge. But when we look at him, he's still been scoring. He's scoring the fantasy points when he's out there. He appeared to be slowing in yards per route run in 2020 and 2021. Went to a 2.18 and 2. Forgot what it was down to. But anyway, it was a false alarm. It was below 2. And I remember everybody, including me, was like, oh my God, Keenan Allen, yards per route run going down. And that's why I'm doing some more research that you guys will be able to check out in the article saying, is this stuff really predictive? But it did go up over the last 2 years, 2.18 and 2.36 yards per route run. So he's really come back. And then against man coverage, a 2.14 yards per route run and a 0.28 targets per route run. So he was still really performing against man coverage, which can be the stiffest test. Like somebody puts their best corner on you and says, okay, dude, go get open. Keenan was still up to the challenge whenever that was happening. So when I look at all that, I think I'm not trying to get overboard on Keenan, but when we look at the price, Marcus, it's just so much better. Now, his ceiling was never what Davante Adams' ceiling is, right? Which is part of why people are still taking Davante Adams in round 2 and Keenan's falling into round 5. But man, when I look at the price tag, it's just much more affordable. Right now, Keenan Allen, you're getting as a wide receiver 33. So I pretty much feel like most of the stuff is priced in. I think the biggest risk right now, obviously the age is a component because some of these guys are just going to fall off. But the other part is he's got to deal with Rome Odunze. He's got to deal with DJ Moore. We have a rookie quarterback in Caleb Williams. So I do think there's some other things that add fragility to Keenan's profile versus that home sweet home that he's had with Justin Herbert over the last few years, where those two guys are just hand in glove. So one thing that I did notice with a lot of this data is these older guys that switch teams, that was the beginning of a fall off. And some of that could be their own team admitting, you know, we watch the guy every day in practice. Like
Yeah.
we know he's not the same. And he got schemed up a lot last year, got moved all over the formation, lots of motion, things like that. So I don't want to say Keenan comes without risk, but man, the price tag is just so much better than Davante Adams. So I'm not aggressively targeting him, but I am more willing to click on him and be, like around the average with the market. I don't want to be necessarily underweight or overweight on my Keenan Allen teams.
And that is kind of where I have fallen. And again, you mentioned it. We talked about him a lot on this show. This is a year where he's got more target competition than he's probably had at any point in his career. When you look at DJ Moore and you look at Romo Dunze, and I know that people have done the research on veteran wide receivers changing teams, and certainly the first year in a lot of those situations has never been particularly great. Throw in the fact, as you mentioned, he's been banged up the last few years, maybe some nagging injuries that are sort of hanging on. There's just a lot of reasons to be concerned. But I've dragged when the board falls the right way and he's right there and I'm comfortable with it, I will make the selection. But it definitely has not been the muscle memory, like, hey, it's Keenan Allen, I'm gonna click on him. For years, he was one of those guys where I was just like, he seems like he's really high up the list of receivers we take for granted. I think this year, though, we're starting to realize that there are some if not red flags, at least pink flags that are there that to be concerned about. What is it? I think that the phrase is, if you're wearing rose
You got to
colored
use the
glasses, you
beach
don't see
thing,
the.
I mean, it's a yellow flag at the beach,
There it is.
and then you get the red flag. Double reds is you can't get in, Marcus.
No,
You're out of the
he's
water.
not. He's not double red. He's certainly not double red.
He's
But
between the red and yellow.
yeah, I think that's fair. So is that with like an orange flag or something? I don't know. Is that a thing? Probably not.
No, no, but what you could say
Uh,
is, the ADP is offsetting some of it. So like my wife and I, we got shark bands because of the shark attacks that happened in Florida. So the kids all
mhm,
wore the shark band. So we had a red flag out there, but at least we had something on their leg to hopefully
mhm.
keep it from getting, bitten.
There
Who
you
knows
go.
if that really worked or not, but whatever. That's a terrible analogy. So just keep moving.
We're all fumbling around here. So let's just move on to DeAndre Hopkins, shall we? A guy who again has been an elite wide receiver in his prime. We've seen him now on a couple of different teams, right? He's gone to Arizona where he was a high performer. Now he's in Tennessee. Was sort of helping break in a rookie quarterback last year in Will Levis, but another guy who just turned 32 earlier in June. I I haven't drafted him, Dwayne, because I just don't know what to make of him or that Tennessee offense, which is going to look vastly different than the Titans offense we've known for the last 8 years or so.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, when you look at Hopkins, again, you have ADP coming in at wide receiver 41, age 32. It's kind of it's priced in, but based on the research that I've done, the signs are definitely there. Like if this was a Taylor Swift thing, we would say that Hopkins is in his turbulence era. How about that, Marcus? So,
I
like
like
in
it.
the last 3 seasons, he's had 2 wide receiver 3 finishes and 1 wide receiver 1 finish. So the signs of decline are definitely there, and he's at the age where it could drop off at any time. So when you look at his underlying data points, they're not terrible. They're borderline wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, kind of right between. His yards per route run is more wide receiver 2 at 2.09 yards per route run. But Will Levis wasn't very good last year. And that can definitely impact yards per route run for a player. Where he talked about that with Larry Fitzgerald. 27% target share, though. That's the positive. That was still wide receiver 1 worthy. But we see this with some of these older guys. They can continue to earn the targets, but can they continue to do a lot with them? The other thing we have with Hopkins, we've had some signs of breakdown. He's missed some time over the last 3 seasons. And again, back to Levis. That's still a risky situation. Might Levis make a big jump next year? Yeah, he could. He could in the 2024 season, but he's still a very unknown quantity. And then you add in Calvin Ridley coming in to provide more target competition. I think it's going to be really tough for Hopkins, even if he's completely healthy, to get anywhere near another 27% target share. I think he's more likely to be 23, 24%ish. I think I have him projected at 23.5% this season. And if the production comes down, the injuries pop up, there's just a lot of ways this could go wrong for Hopkins. Again, already being priced as a wide receiver 4, and I'm defining a cliff year as a wide receiver 4 year. So you could also make the argument, dude, you're already getting to draft him at a cliff price. My question is, though, what's really the upside here? with Hopkins. I feel like a lot's got to go right. Now, I do think the Titans are going to pass the ball a lot more this year with Callahan. They've loaded up on the weapons. They even added Tyler Boyd for the slot. So we know they want to see what they have in Will Levis. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's just going to mean a lot of fantasy points. Just because teams throw the ball a lot doesn't mean that equates to fantasy points. The quality of quarterback play is still a huge driver. So I feel like there's enough risk here for me, Marcus. I'm not going to call him a full fade because he is a wide receiver 41, but I don't want to be overexposed. I'm trying to be under exposure on Hopkins.
Yeah, I mean, this is for me where the ADP sort of makes it a little bit more palatable. But like I said at the start of this, there's so much unknown about this offense and sort of where DeAndre Hopkins is. I've been slowly coming around to Will Levis a little bit, but again, that's in
Yes.
best balls, that's as a third or third quarterback option. So even then, it is sort of kind of a muted excitement about where I am with him, and that sort of trickles down to all the rest of the receivers in that Tennessee offense as well.
Levis is like, it's like a scratch off, you know? I mean, it could go right, but most of the time you're getting nothing except just handing the money over, right, to someone
Right.
else. But there is that scratch off allure with him where you could just see a season going right with Ridley and Hopkins and Levis, and he wants to push the ball down the field. So I'm with you. I'm definitely, I think when I am drafting Hopkins, I'm definitely trying to get Will Levis.
Yeah.
And it's in a spot of the draft where you can set it up with Jaguar stacks if you're trying to do the week 17 thing. So I think there's definitely things to like there, but like in a vacuum with Hopkins, I want to be underweight.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Let's move on to the age 31 group of receivers. And this is a really intriguing group of names because you've got, a guy that I think is still very much an elite, that everybody is still believing is an elite. And a couple of guys that are sort of question marks. It could be great, could be somewhere in between. But let's start with Tyreek Hill, because I don't think there's any doubt that this guy's still very much at the top of his game. I mean, we were talking early in the season last year that he was on pace maybe for a 2,000-yard receiving season. Unfortunately, injuries kind of derailed that a little bit. But I don't think there's any doubt right now, Dwayne, that everybody is willing to go all in on Tyreek Hill. The fact that he's a top 3 pick in a lot of leagues, I think suggests that we're all still very confident in him.
Yeah, and when you look at Tyreek Hill, I mean, age 31, right? So that's a little bit better than what we've been talking about. Obviously, all the guys we're going to talk about here are in that age 31 cohort. He is the wide receiver too off the board. So you got to spend an early first round pick on him,
Mhm.
but there are not any signs. And remember, like if we go back to the research I did, again, not saying this stuff's predictive, but just trying to get our arms around how do we pick up on these signals. Only 22% of these elite guys hit a cliff without some sort of signal, an injury, a gradual decline, or some sort of turbulence. And we haven't seen any of that with Tyreek Hill. This guy's showing no signs of stopping whatsoever. He delivered his best fantasy finish ever last season at 23.7 points per game. So essentially, like this guy has the ceiling of Christian McCaffrey. And it's really hard to find that at wide receiver. Even if you throw in names like CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, I think Tyreek Hill is still the wide receiver with the highest ceiling. He could be like a running back one that's that pure catches balls, gets the balls, inside the 5-yard line and is scoring those touchdowns. Like he's on that level. So for me, even though the price tag is expensive, I don't have him, as someone that like I'm going out of my way to take it pick one or anything. I'm just taking him every time I have a chance to take him at pick 3. Like I'm not getting cute. I'm not like, oh, I'll take Jamar Chase because he's younger. And the reason why, man, the upside is just too high. If you look at that the underlying data also supports this. 3.82 yards per route run last year. That is insane. A 31% target share. Now, we did have Jalen Waddle on and off the field quite a bit. So I can see that coming down a little bit. But Tyreek is just still such an elite playmaker. And again, crushing against man coverage, 3.95 yards per route run and 33% targets per route run. So basically, when Tua sees, I've got man coverage on Tyreek Hill, 1 out of 3 times he's trying to get the ball to him, which is what we see from guys that are still alphas. Some risk, obviously, because he is in this age bucket, and we have had examples where they've dropped off. But for the most part, we have seen some sort of sign historically, and we haven't seen it for Hill. So I'm still good with taking him in the early part of round 1.
Yeah, I mean, this one feels like one of those rare sort of cut and dry. Like we're still all in, and yeah, maybe there is the sudden. Look, the reason it's a sudden fall off is because you don't see it coming, right? It's sudden, but there's nothing, as you mentioned, there's nothing that suggests we are headed toward that cliff with Tyreek Hill. Mike Evans, another one that doesn't seem to be headed for a cliff. I mean, last year looked just like Mike Evans. I know at the beginning of last year, I was skeptical. I was like, I don't know. And then, about a month or 6 weeks into the season, I was offering public apologies because he was just out there crushing it again. Double-digit touchdowns once again. Dwayne, I know there's a new offensive coach there in Tampa, but other than that, they kept the band back together. Your thoughts after what you dove into and found with Mike Evans?
Yeah, I mean, right now he's coming off the board as the wide receiver 17. So people are looking at him as a mid wide receiver 2. So again, the price is fine. I'm essentially wanting to be even to the field on Evans, but I don't want to be overweight. I thought it was really interesting what you brought up. Kind of the flags were there around Mike Evans, which is why you've got to be really careful with some of these underlying data points. And again, I'll get to that in the article, but his yards per route run from 2020 to 2022 were not wide receiver 1 worthy. 1.79, 1.65, 1.81. But he rebounded to a 2.32 with Baker freaking Mayfield moving away from Tom Brady. Well, if you think about Tom Brady, what does he do? You give him zone coverage, he's not taking the difficult throw. He's not going to force it into coverage. Baker is willing to do that. Brady would not. Brady went away from Evans against zone coverage. So his targets per route run against zone coverage, 16%, 17%, and 19% with Tom Brady. Last year with Mayfield, 24%. So that was the difference. He's always been getting fed against man coverage. The difference was, and maybe it's because who knows, Mayfield just can't read coverage as good as Tom Brady, or it's a mindset thing. I don't know. Some of this stuff can be tricky to figure out the exact why to them, but Mayfield was the difference. So I think when you look at Mike Evans, clearly his skills have deteriorated some. If we go back to that first table we looked at, where we look at the prime years versus the years they're in now, he's obviously, he fits that. He's not quite at the level that he was when he was at his pinnacle in his prime years, but I still think he's capable of 15 to 16 fantasy points per game. And that's essentially what drafters are saying about him. They're like mid-range wide receiver 2. Well, what's the cutoff for wide receiver 1s? 16 fantasy points. And you're drafting him, as a mid-range wide receiver 2. So I think the market's actually really sharp on Evans. I am willing to definitely mix him in. But again, another player I'm not trying to be overexposure because he is a round 2 pick right now if you're playing best ball.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is, one, we also need to be able to pencil him in for 1,000 yards. That has been the story of his career. The touchdown numbers definitely sort of inflated what he could be potentially fantasy wise. I guess the upside with Baker versus Tom Brady, as you mentioned, Tom Brady reads defenses. He's going to go where the guy is open. Baker Mayfield is just sort of like, F it, Mike's down there somewhere, and we're going to throw it up there. We're going to see what happens.
Baker regression is another risk, right? I mean, we've seen 2 decent seasons from Baker in his career, and then we've seen everything else be trash. So that's a risk for Mike Evans too.
Yeah.
That actually might be a bigger risk than
anything else. Stefon Diggs in this group is maybe the most intriguing name to me because look, things did not end well for him in Buffalo, although that might have had more to do with in the locker room than necessarily on the field. Although, Dwayne, I mean, to be honest, his on-field performance at the end of the season was not particularly remarkable. Now he's in a place with a lot more competition, a new offense. I was surprised. I mean, you got him as a buy. I'm not against it because I have this theory where he goes on his kind of supervillain arc and he destroys the league to prove that Buffalo made a mistake. But there's a lot more competition, I think, than he's ever had in his career when it comes to targets too.
Yeah, that's totally true. What I'm looking at with Diggs is I don't think that his talent fell off in the way that I've been hearing a little bit in the marketplace. So I disagree with the market. The Stefon Diggs, is he what he was in his prime years? No. But we know that's going to be true for most receivers at this age. You're not going to find many that are still at their prime. Tyreek Hill is like, that's a rare animal, right? That he's still absolutely at his pinnacle right now. So Stefon Diggs has taken a little bit of a step back, but Marcus, we're still talking about a guy that's got 4 consecutive wide receiver 1 finishes, but his ADP is falling. And it is partially because of what you talked about. We don't know who the target leader is going to be in Houston. And I'm not guaranteeing you that it's going to be Stefon Diggs. I'm not even saying it's going to be him. Like, I still like Nico Collins. I love Tank Dell as well. It could be any one of them. But what I know is really the cause for Stefon Diggs going down last year was the fact that they switched to an offense that turned run first. He was still doing what he needed to do, Marcus. He was out there earning targets. And I know some people are like, well, his yards per route run, we're down to 1.99 last year. So that's not wide receiver 1 material. You're now dropping into wide receiver 2. But he also had a 27% target share, which is wide receiver 1. But here's the thing. his yards per route run over the last 4 years, 2.51, then it went to 1.91. Did that mean he suddenly wasn't a wide receiver one anymore? Then it bounced back to 2.49. Oh, wait, he's a wide receiver one, everybody. And then last year it was 1.99. So if you look at him against man, he's also had the same kind of thing, a 3.36. Then it went down to 1.65, then up to 2.65, then down to 1.88. So I have heard some people, well, I'm most worried about Stefon Diggs because of that 1.88 targets per route run against man. And while that is intriguing to me, and I have talked about it, I still think that's a descriptive stat at this point, right? It's not a predictive stat. And we've just seen it in Stefon Diggs himself over the last 4 years. So I think it's something where we'll see what they do with him in the offense. Are they going to move him around? Is he going to be static? Does Tank Dell get all of the treatment with all the motion? I think things like that could definitely come into play as to who's going to be the best wide receiver in Houston. But the main thing I'm looking at with Diggs, Marcus, is I look at him and I say, okay, this is a guy now sliding in the middle of third round. Sometimes in drafts where I'm getting him at the end of third round, right? He's down to wide receiver 23. That is too far below Mike Evans. Baker Mayfield with Mike Evans plus just Chris Godwin versus I could have CJ Stroud with Nico Collins and Tank Dell against Stefon Diggs. I think those two things are pretty close. And so in my opinion, like I would flip this whole thing. If Stefon Diggs was the guy going at wide receiver 17 and Mike Evans was going at wide receiver 23, Mike Evans would be my buy and Stefon Diggs would then be the guy that I'm saying, okay, I'm probably just going to be even with the market, maybe a little under. So a lot of this still comes back, as Ian always likes to say, hate the ADP, not the player. And that's what I'm talking about here with Diggs. But the profile is still there at his current price that I think this is a guy that has not shown that he is on a downward trend. Again, 4 consecutive wide receiver one or better, or can't be better than that, wide receiver one finishes. So I like Stefon Diggs. I'm buying at his current price.
And I think so. Again, I go back and forth on which Diggs was the Diggs we saw sort of at the end of last season. Is that signs of a decline, or you also have the argument that you mentioned. He's with Nico Collins. He's with Tank Dell. Defenses have to pay attention to those other guys. They cannot focus all their energies on Stefon Diggs. Maybe that opens some things up for him. And going to CJ Stroud, you're not looking at a drop off in quarterback play either. There's reasons to believe Stefon Diggs can still be really productive this year.
Yeah. And I think the other thing, with Diggs, while I mean, his targets did, go down last year, right? Your raw counting stat targets went down in the second half of the season. His target shares did not go down. So here they are from week 11 on, 27%, 23%, 33%, 38%, 38%, 25%, playoffs, 22%, 30%, and 21%. So this is a guy that was still clearly out there earning targets. Can he quite do what he used to be able to do with them? No. But I think there's still meat on the bone with Stefon Diggs. I think the biggest instigator to his problems last year was just the Bills decided to totally change their philosophy and shell up and just win games with defense and let Josh Allen turn into a running back for the second half of last year once we had Joe Brady take over the OC duties.
Yeah. Last one in this group, Cooper Kupp, who's another intriguing option here, 31 years old, and missed the beginning of last season with an injury, and that's when we saw Puka Nacua really burst onto the scene. Then Kupp comes back, and both Kupp and Nacua learn to sort of exist peaceably together. He's a guy that's going where, like second round, or third round in a lot of drafts right now. I mean, your feelings on a guy who has been so good for so long, but another guy that, look, he's got an aging quarterback. He's got a young wide receiver that's shown to be elite on the other side. Your feelings on Cooper Kupp right now?
I want to be below the market on Cooper Kupp, and I didn't feel that way until I did really finished out this research. He has honestly been a guy that I've been a little bit more aggressive on. And I think a lot of it was coming back to I've seen the ceiling with a Cooper Kupp. Like he is kind of like what we talked about with Tyreek Hill. Just a few years ago, this was a guy that was more like a high-end running back one, an elite running back one. But as I really dug into it, I mean, number one, registered his first wide receiver 3 finish since his rookie campaign at 13.5 fantasy points per game last year. Now, on the positive side, you can say, look, he was playing through injuries. He got hurt, like you mentioned, in the preseason. He aggravated it. They had to shut him down for 4 weeks. He came back. He got hurt again. He played through the injuries. So there's certainly some stuff there with Cooper Kupp that part of the decline could have been because he was playing hurt. But on the negative side of that same thing, Marcus, the injuries have been a problem. I mean, we're talking about Kupp missing 8 and 5 games over the last 2 seasons. And injuries are one of the precursors that we've talked about, being one of the signs that we need to be aware of. Does it mean we can guarantee anything? No. But it's just, we're just stacking up like all the data points, right? And it's not a positive that he's been having these injuries. And then if you look at his underlying data points, they've been declining over the last 2 years. Yards per route run, targets per route run have gone down from 3.12, this is yards per route run, to 2.40, and the last year 1.86. Now, we've also seen other guys like Keenan Allen kind of show that and bounce back. But Keenan did that at a little bit younger age than where Kupp's at right now in this age 31 season. And then if you look at those target shares, drop from 30% to 28% to 23%. And then against man coverage, this is a bit of an alert, and this could be the injury thing, but a 1.32 yards per route run. That's a career worst. And now the man zone stuff is not predictive. So again, that's descriptive. But still, you want to see a guy like Cooper Kupp when he gets man coverage be like Stafford's going, oh, bud, okay, bud, like I know I'm coming to you and I know you're going to be able to perform. That just wasn't the case last year. So once I add all that up and the fact that Puka Nacua was amazing last year, typically rookies that play as well as Puka Nacua, they're usually studs. Rarely do they turn into busts. So what's the ceiling here? I mean, Cooper Kupp is not what he used to be. Puka Nacua might be a complete stud. So that ceiling of being a high-end wide receiver one without an injury to Puka is gone. And even then, Kupp would need to basically be better than what we've seen over the last 2 years, and he would need to be able to avoid a lot of the signs that we've seen that can often turn a guy like him into a wide receiver 4 or worse at the snap of a finger. So with Kupp, he's a guy now that I'm reining it in. I'm overexposed on Cooper Kupp right now, so I'm changing that because of, what's happened. I will say, again, I mentioned this earlier, but age 30 plus wide receivers battling through significant injuries, 40% of them did return to wide receiver 1 status. So I'm never going to say never on Cooper Kupp, but once you factor in Nacua, I'm thinking we're kind of hoping he's a wide receiver 2. You're drafting him as a low-end wide receiver 2 already, but there's also this 40% chance, looking at that injury data, that he just hits a cliff. And so I think once you factor that in, I think he's a guy I feel more comfortable drafting as like a high-end wide receiver 3 versus a low-end wide receiver 2. I'm not calling him a full fade because he's Cooper Kupp, but I do think he's a guy that I want to be more careful with.
I just gotta ask: are you more willing to, maybe if you want pieces of the Rams offense, to pivot to Nacua, because that's a hefty price tag you got to pay to get Puka Nacua right now?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it last year in the games where you had Cooper Kupp and Nacua on the field, 29% target share for Puka and 27% for Kupp. So they were pretty close. Like from that lens, that's why I was heavy on Kupp up until now. I'm like, oh, I'm getting a guy that's just barely under the other dude, 2 rounds later. So give me Cooper Kupp. But once I kind of started reacquainting myself with all this data and digging into, some of the deeper things around these former elite performers, I think there's enough here that, yeah, I think you just want to be in on Puka. And when you get Puka and you want to try to make the Rams stack, I think it's fine. Those are the times where if you want to throw in some Cooper Kupp, okay. I'm not saying being totally opposed to Cooper Kupp at his ADP, but I was reaching past ADP to get him. So I'm just not going to do that anymore.
Yeah. And the thing about the Rams stack, I mean, Matthew Stafford, it's a lot easier to put Matthew Stafford there on a roster than maybe getting a different quarterback there. All right, so we've gone through the age 32, we've gone through the age 31. As you sort of, again, we kind of zoom back out to a more of a 30,000 foot, maybe this is a 20,000 foot view, but your
15,
final takeaways,
15, Marcus.
Yeah, there we go, we'll cut it in half. Your takeaways though on what you pulled from these, at least these 2 age buckets of receivers you looked at.
Yeah, so I mean, looking at the recap, of all these guys, the main thing is you've got 3 guys with signs of decline: Davante Adams, DeAndre Hopkins, and Cooper Kupp. 2 of those guys are in the age 32 bucket. So I'm fading Davante Adams. You want to be below the market, I believe, on DeAndre Hopkins. I want to be below the market on Cooper Kupp. Tyreek Hill, Stefon Diggs, those guys, based on their ADP and their talent profiles and their age, look like buys. And then the other 2 guys we want to be even with the market on, for me, are Keenan Allen, Mike Evans. But I think the other higher thing here, Marcus, is none of them are truly deal breaker picks that you have to just avoid. I mean, I do think Davante Adams is for me, but even if you wanted to mix in some Davante Adams, I think you're fine. But I think the other thing you need to remember is you don't want to pile up a bunch of these guys together. Just think, we don't know who for sure, But there are going to be some names that are like the Marty McFly picture from Back to the Future, and you're going to be looking at it about midseason. You're like, whoa, half of Davante Adams' body is gone. Like some of these guys are going to disappear, and I don't have a flux capacitor, so I can't tell you for sure. I can't travel forward in time and tell you which ones it's going to be, but there's going to be some guys that are going to fall off, and they're going to be wide receiver threes or wide receiver fours or worse. It's going to happen to some of them. So I think the other thing to remember as you're building out your teams, I don't want to stack all these guys together. So say if I start with Tyreek Hill, I don't want to come back down at the end of round 2 and take Mike Evans and then turn around and take Stefon Diggs. Even though I said I like Diggs and I like Tyreek Hill and I'm buying them, still all 3 of those guys together, that's 2 buys and a guy that I'm even with the market on. But I still don't necessarily want all 3 of them on the same team if I can avoid it. And I definitely don't want the fades together. If I've already drafted Davante Adams, say he falls to me in round 3, I'm not circling back for DeAndre Hopkins and Cooper Kupp. Like, I'm just not. I'm probably going to say I'm going to have one of these dudes on my team. I don't want to have multiple. Okay. So I think that's the high level takeaway, just thinking about your overall roster construction. And you want to really try to balance things out. You want to get some exposure to some of the younger players. So I think just trying to really mix it up. But I will go deeper on this. There's going to be an article I've already mentioned a few times. It'll drop on Friday. And I'm also going to break down the wide receiver 2. So today we just talked about those true elites that had at least 3 wide receiver 1 finishes on their resume. So kind of a similar exercise, but looking at guys that mostly had wide receiver 2 finishes on their resume. How did they stack up versus these elites? And how should we treat them in drafts as well?
Oh, looking forward to that. That's absolutely something. If you guys are out there, just go bookmark this show. Get ready for the article to drop on fantasylife.com and get ready. I love this because I think in some ways it is kind of intuitive. We're obviously like, hey, you don't want to load up a team with too many older wide receivers, but I think this gives everybody just some sort of check boxes, right? Things that kind of, in your mind say, okay, this is why I might not want to, draft Davante Adams, or maybe why I should be concerned about DeAndre Hopkins. It's just sort of nice to kind of have it broken down into actionable reasons, as opposed to just our gut feeling of, hey, I don't want too many old guys on my team. So looking forward to the article coming out, and especially with the wide receiver 2, because that can definitely be a minefield when it comes to drafting teams in the very near future. So it's been a full fun show. Hopefully you guys were informed and entertained, and we didn't fumble around with our beach flag references too many times, and you had a good one there. As we mentioned, go to Fantasy Life, get the article there, sign up for the newsletter, go check out all the tools, all the stats, all the fun things to play around with. That should help you get better when it comes to drafting, sports betting, and all the other things to help you sweat out your sports watching experience. In the meantime, that'll do it for this edition of the Utilization Report Debrief. Shout out to Matt LaMarca for putting this together. For Dwayne McFarland, I am Marcus Grant. Enjoy the week, everybody. Stay cool wherever you are, and we'll talk to you again real soon.